Hi everyone. In this video, I want to continue with my series on debunking young Earth creationism. So previously I talked about some astronomical arguments, and I'll get onto those again in subsequent episodes, but now I want to talk about biological arguments. Now, this kind of really gets to the idea of the kind, K-I-N-D, which is a idea that creationists use a lot. It's meant to sort of depict a grouping of organisms which are similar within that group. So, like wolves and dogs and foxes might be part of a kind. And most creationists would actually acknowledge the possibility of evolution to some extent. So they would say that evolution is possible, but only within a kind. You can't go beyond that kind. So they might say, and certainly they would acknowledge that you can have evolution within a species, which is not the same as a kind, by the way, but I'll get onto that in a second. But they would acknowledge that you could have microevolution within a species, and many of them would acknowledge that you can have even speciation, so the generation of one species from another. But it's always going to be within the kind, right? This kind of boundary beyond which you can't go. Now, the problem there's actually many problems, but one of the problems is that they never justify in scientific terms how is it that you can't go beyond that boundary. So what is the mechanism stopping evolution from, incrementally going beyond that delineation point? So that's not justified scientifically because you need a mechanism to explain to explain that, and they don't provide that. The other problem is that they want to say that Homo sapiens, are their own kind. They don't want to acknowledge that humans could have evolved from other primates. And so they're not going to acknowledge that humans are part of a broader kind. Okay, so because then that would slip in the possibility that humans could have evolved naturally from other primates. So they can't let that be true. So humans have to be their own kind. So that's just arbitrary, though. It's completely arbitrary. Humans and chimps actually share closer genetic affinity to each other, similarity to each other than horses and zebras do, right? And I think most creationists would be fairly comfortable assigning zebras and horses to their own kind, as a group, but not humans and chimps and other primates. It has to be humans only in their own kind. So that's arbitrary, because if you're going to say zebras and horses are a kind together, then why not humans and other primates? So again, completely arbitrary. It shows that the kind is not a scientific category. It's just whatever the creationist wants it to be. The other problem is that different creationists will map different taxonomic hierarchical levels to a kind. So some of them will say that it's the genus, which is a kind. Others are going to say it's the family or the order. Others are going to say, I think even phylum level. I think I've heard some creationists allude to that an entire phylum could be a kind. But that's already allowing a huge amount of evolution and species diversification, within that so-called kind. So what's stopping it from going beyond that? And you're already acknowledging evolution by that point, macroevolution. So that already kind of undercuts your whole case. If you're trying to disprove macroevolution by, allowing that such a broad category could be a kind, that completely is like shooting yourself in the foot. So many problems there, okay? There's also the problem that, well, let me just first talk about what a species is. So species and kinds are not the same, and, creationists acknowledge that usually. Species are, there's different definitions of species, but they're each used precisely in different contexts, and they apply in different contexts. So we know what we're talking about when we talk about a species, because we assign a certain species concept to a particular case. So, for example, we could say that using the biological species concept, which is one particular species concept, that if two individuals, male, female, brought together, they could potentially produce viable offspring together, then they are part of the same species by that definition of the biological species concept. So, that's a precise definition. And the category of species breaks down a little bit when we talk about asexual lineages, which are found all over even in the animal kingdom, there are many asexual so-called species, but they don't need to mate in order to reproduce, so it's basically clonal reproductive events, okay? Although some can switch back and forth between asexual and sexual reproduction. And of course, there's also like bacteria and archaea, which, they use different mechanisms for acquiring genetic diversity, including gene swapping through conjugation and a couple of other mechanisms, but they don't have sexual reproduction, right? And of course, the Bible doesn't talk about that. Bacteria didn't even acknowledge their existence at all. But if we're thinking about the Bible story, the Genesis story specifically, it talks about Noah's Ark, and that Noah and his family survived the flood, and they got onto the ark, right? And along with them came a pair of each kind of animal. So these kinds would have to be much less numerous than the species that we find in the world empirically. There are well over 1 million species that have been documented by science, and science is pretty sure that there are millions more species out there, maybe even 15 million species or something like that. So how do you get that much diversity from the cohort on board Noah's Ark? That's the problem. Now remember, we're dealing with a very short time span, so Noah's Ark is meant to have happened according to the Usher calendar, which is what Young Earth Creationists use. I think it's 2349 BC, I believe. And then, so that's a very short period of time, compared to like what science says is the age of the Earth, which is like billions of years old, right? So a very short period of time, you need to generate all that diversity from that cohort of kinds to get what we see today in all the species. The problem, of course, is that not just the time limitation, but also that the Bible does not describe God creating new kinds after he created the world in a few days, right? That's when he created the kinds in the story, not afterwards. So you need some sort of mechanism to generate all that diversity after the flood. After the animals got off the boat, they had to repopulate the world. That means that they had to diversify into all the different species. And guess what? That requires macroevolution. So that's the very thing that creationists try to deny. Okay, at least they try to deny that is how humans could have formed. But you need a lot of macroevolution to account for, or to make the story consistent with empirical reality. And because of the short time scale, you need actually a very much greater rate of evolution than any evolutionary biologist would acknowledge is plausible given empirical evidence. Okay, so you need a massive amount of the very thing that you're trying to deny. So very ironic there. So completely destroys itself by its own logic and by the fact that we observe millions of species in the world. There's probably millions more. You need to generate that through some mechanism. The only mechanism available is evolution, precisely the thing that you're trying to deny the reality of. And there's also like the plant diversity. I think that the Bible doesn't even acknowledge plants as living things. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's what it doesn't acknowledge them as living things. And certainly doesn't describe them accurately in terms of their history and their diversity. But again, you would need that sort of, initial diversity on the boat. And then you have to account for the diversity that we see today. So some mechanism to produce that. As I mentioned, bacteria and also archaea, these are prokaryotic groups that do not engage in sexual reproduction. They use asexual reproduction. And many animals do this as well. Okay, Bible doesn't mention that at all. And many other groups of organisms that are not mentioned in the Bible. So this also, the story also breaks down because of logistical problems, like how do you get the animals to sort of coordinate themselves into an ecosystem? How do you get the genetic diversity back up quickly enough to avoid inbreeding effects and bottleneck effects and all those sorts of things? And also, how do you transport like the koalas and the other marsupials to Australia? Like that doesn't make any sense. Was there like a giant land bridge or something? Or, all these logistical problems, you can come up with all sorts of fanciful stories to try to fix it, but ultimately it doesn't work at all. You just end up with more problems that you compound because you try to make this myth scientific and it's just not. But, just by itself, the fact that you need macroevolution to save the story, it right there destroys itself, because macroevolution is the very thing that creationists want to get around. And yet they need a massive, dose of that in the story itself to make it consistent with what we see empirically. So, obviously Young Earth Creationism is not scientific. They might call themselves creation scientists, but they're not doing science at all. They can't be doing science when you've got these sorts of logical contradictions in the story. Anyway, let me know if I missed out on anything, and I'll talk to you soon. Thank you.